Listening in and taking note. Kirsten Engels is lifting standards in one of the country's busiest sex crimes units. She spent decades investigating sex crimes across the Trans-Tasman and says it's not just the details of the abuse that have stayed with her, but the survivor's trauma that goes hand in hand with it.
Dealing with somebody who's been the victim of a serious crime, specifically domestic violence, sexual abuse, child victims, that they're very traumatised. It may be something that they don't want to talk about, but they do want something done about it.
The seasoned sex crimes investigator worked in New Zealand and Queensland before taking up a post with the Northern Territory Police. She recognised quickly a need to improve training on the forensic interviews critical in getting sex crimes cases to court.
We're actually doing the job of a prosecutor, a senior Crown. We're doing the evidence in chief of a vulnerable person, so it's absolutely critical that we get it right.
This is the result of years of lobbying and hard work. A 2-week course co-designed with Deakin University. It engages students from local primary schools to teach police how memory works. For the students, it's an excursion to police headquarters in Darwin, exploring the grounds and answering questions on a benign school activity.
What colour was he wearing? Black.
But for police, it's a masterclass in how to build rapport with vulnerable witnesses and learn best practice forensic interviewing skills.
The ramifications of not getting it right is that the evidence might be tainted, which means that it could be thrown out, it may not go to court, and some of these kids may never see justice in their cases.
They're critical improvements in a jurisdiction that consistently records the highest rates of sexual assault in the nation. Deakin University's Dr. Megan Danby has worked in Victoria and the Northern Territory training police and says the quality of police interviews she's seen varies greatly.
There's a huge amount of abuse that's going unreported. So it's really important that the cases that do come to us are treated with respect, and we give it the best chance we have to collect that evidence and see just outcomes for that case.
According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, sexual assault was almost a daily event in the Territory in 2019. About a quarter of victims were children under 14 years old. 23 sexual assault victims were children under 9. Health experts say those figures are just a small indication of a much larger problem.
We see a lot of children through our service. But we see children where there's not enough of a disclosure for police to go ahead with that case, and we see them to try to deal with that trauma that we know is going to be an after effect of the sexual assault.
Top-end health staff say that the sexual assault medical examinations they do have more than tripled since 2012, with an increase of boys, men and gender-diverse people coming forward. Dealing with that increase has been a struggle, with the sexual assault referral clinic stripped of its outreach program more than a decade ago. They're now having to rebuild that team to allow for a greater focus on follow-up and prevention.
If you think that about 80% of sexual assault victims are sexually assaulted by someone known to them, it's imperative that we get prevention measures out there as quickly as possible, and we've been talking to the education department about that and how we can get protected behaviours and healthy relationships in all the schools, but also that education that parents need to understand cyber safety, and that it's not just stranger danger that we need to talk to our children about. It's about children knowing their bodies, knowing what's making them feel uncomfortable, knowing who they can tell if there's a problem.
Only a fraction of the victims presenting to the sexual assault referral clinic will go on to talk to police. The reasons for that are complex and varied, but in the case of one student who doesn't want to be named, it was a negative experience with police that derailed her first attempt to report the sexual abuse she suffered in primary school.
The way they were trying to get me to talk was they were trying to guilt me into it and trying to say, oh, if you don't come forward, other people could get hurt.
The experience was so damaging, it took 2 years before she was ready to speak again. She says a friend went cop shopping through the Child Abuse Task Force to find an officer she could relate to. That officer was Kirsten Engels.
She explained the whole process to me. She explained to me what I would expect. She told me that I wouldn't have to sit in the courtroom. I didn't know any of that. Had I known that, maybe I would have come forwards earlier.
Northern Territory Police will now have to make that investigation process more transparent with an online guide. It's part of work outlined in the Northern Territory Sexual Violence Prevention and Response Framework, a document released by the Northern Territory Government quietly early last year. Among 22 asks of various government agencies is one that commits the Northern Territory Police to developing an enforceable code of practice for sex crimes investigations, including the techniques used for interviewing vulnerable witnesses.
It's absolutely important. Trauma has a profound effect on the neurobiology of the brain and how people perceive, how they experience, how they retain and recall memories. And so I think if you're going to interview someone and want to ascertain what has happened, understanding how that memory is stored and the right questions and an expectation of what is a reasonable answer to give.
There's no outline on what the new guidelines will include or when they'll be available, but health experts say even guidelines on when a forensic interview can take place could improve the quality of responses, with research showing how important sleep cycles are to memory. They say an understanding of how trauma-affected brains store and recall memories is critical.
It's unrealistic to expect a story from A, B, C, D, E and F. This is what's happened in this chronological order when someone's had a really traumatic experience. And that's the science, yeah? So it's not an opinion, that's what the research is telling us. This is how the memory's stored and this is how it's compromised.
It's very difficult at times, and it's times very frustrating as well to be able to find the best solution, because there's not always the perfect solution. And children, as you know, often find it very difficult to be able to tell their story. And sitting in front of a camera, I know how difficult that is, and when a child's interviewed, it's usually in front of the camera. So they can at times find that really difficult. So to try and make sure we have the best safety plan in place at times is challenging.
Kirsten Engels remains focused on the front line and the training police need to better serve the community.
What I tend to think is that, and I tell the investigators, and this weighs pretty heavily, is that you may be the only person in that child or that vulnerable person's life that they ever allow into those details.
Promoted to Superintendent Regional Crime, Kirsten Engels is moving on from Darwin to take up a new role in Alice Springs. But the forensic interviewing course she helped to create will continue. Letitia Lemke, ABC News.